Clara Barton, born 1821, died 1912. Follow along with me in your American Experience book beginning on page 193. And if you chance to feel that the positions I occupied were rough and unseemly for a woman, I can only reply that they were rough and unseemly for men, but under all lay the life of the nation. Quoted by Cora Bacon Foster and Clara Barton, Humanitarian, 1918. Christmas Day, 1821, brought Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield, into the world. Despite her shy disposition, Clara always stepped forward to help others, from her injured brother David to the little children she taught as a teenage teacher, to the brave soldiers she saved as an adult. When Clara was almost 40 years old, the Civil War began. True to her style, Clara jumped to help, organizing medical supplies and serving as a nurse on the battlefields. Once, a bullet grazed her sleeve as she tended to a soldier, but still she would march out to help. After the war, she helped to find and reunite missing soldiers with their families. In the early 1870s, Clara visited Europe and worked with the International Red Cross, which inspired her to found the American Red Cross. She returned to the States and did so, becoming the organization's first president. She was a passionate and resolute leader. She never took a salary, but often contributed some of her own money to the organization's projects. The following excerpt is from Heroines of Service by Mary R. Parkman, chapter Our Lady of the Red Cross. A Christmas baby? Now isn't that the best kind of a Christmas gift for us all? Cried Captain Stephen Barton, who took the interesting flannel bundle from the nurse's arms and held it out proudly to the assembled family. No longed-for heir to a waiting kingdom could have received a more royal welcome than did that little girl who appeared at the Barton home in Oxford, Massachusetts on Christmas Day, 1821. 10 years had passed since a child had come to the comfortable farmhouse, and the 4 big brothers and sisters were very sure that they could not have had any more precious gift than this Christmas baby. No one doubted that she deserved a distinguished name, but it was due to her sister Dorothy, who was a young lady of romantic 17, and something of a reader, that she was called Clarissa Harlowe, after a well-known heroine of fiction. The name, which this heroine of real life actually bore and made famous, however, was Clara Barton, for the Christmas baby proved to be a gift not only to a little group of loving friends, but also to a great nation and to humanity. The sisters and brothers were teachers rather than playmates for Clara, and her education began so early that she had no recollection of the way they led her toddling steps through the beginnings of book learning. On her first day at school, she announced to the amazed teacher, who tried to put a primer into her hands, that she could spell the artichoke words. The teacher had other surprises besides the discovery that this mite of 3 was acquainted with 3-syllable lore. Brother Stephen, who was a wizard with figures, had made sums with which he covered her slate seem a fascinating sort of play at a period when most infants are content with counting the fingers of one hand. All other interests, however, paled before the stories that her father told her of great men and their splendid deeds. Captain Barton was amused one day at the discovery that his precocious daughter, who always eagerly encored his tales of conquerors and leaders, thought of their greatness in images of quite literal and realistic bigness. A president must, for instance, be as large as a house, and a vice president as spacious as a barn door, at the very least. But these somewhat crude conceptions did not put a check on the epic recitals of the retired officer, who, in the intervals of active service in plowed fields or in pastures where his thoroughbreds grazed with their mettlesome colts, liked to live over the days when he served under Mad Anthony Wayne in the Revolutionary War, and had a share in thrilling adventures of the western frontier. Clara was only 5 years old when Brother David taught her to ride. "Learning to ride is just learning a horse," said this daring youth, who was the Buffalo Bill of the surrounding country. "How can I learn a horse, David?" quavered the child, as the high-spirited animals came whinnying to the pasture bars at her brother's call. "Catch hold of his mane, Clara, and just feel the horse a part of yourself, the big half for the time being," said David. as he put her on the back of a colt that was broken only to bit and halter, and easily springing on his favorite, held the reins of both in one hand, while he steadied the small sister with the other by seizing hold of one excited foot. They went over the fields at a gallop that first day, and soon little Clara and her mount understood each other so well that her riding feats became almost as far famed as those of her brother. The time came when her skill and competence on horseback, her power to feel the animal she rode a part of herself, and keep her place in any sort of saddle through night-long gallops, meant the saving of many lives. David taught her many other practical things that helped to make her steady and self-reliant in the face of emergencies. She learned, for instance, to drive a nail straight and to tie a knot that would hold. Eye and hand were trained to work together with quick decision that made for readiness and efficiency in dealing with a situation, whether it meant the packing of a box or first aid measures after an accident on the skating pond. She was always an outdoor child, with dogs, horses, and ducks for playfellows. The fuzzy ducklings were the best sort of dolls. Sometimes when wild ducks visited the pond and all her waddling favorites began to flap their wings excitedly, it seemed that her young heart felt, too, the call of large free spaces. "The only real fun is to do things," she used to say. She rode after the cows, helped in the milking and churning, and followed her father about, dropping potatoes in their holes or helping weed the garden. Once, when the house was being painted, she begged to be allowed to assist in the work, even learning to grind the pigments and mix the colors. The family was at first amused and then amazed at the persistency of her application, as day after day she donned her apron and fell to work. They were not less astonished when she wanted to learn in the work of the weavers in her brother's satinette mills. At first, her mother refused this extraordinary request, but Stephen, who understood the intensity of her cravings to do things, took her part. And at the end of her first week in the flying shuttle, Clara had the satisfaction of finding that her cloth was passed as first-quality goods. Her career as a weaver was of short duration, however, owing to a fire which destroyed the mills. The young girl was enthusiastic in play as at work, whether it was a canter over the fields on Billy, while her dog Button dashed along at her side, his curly white tail bobbing ecstatically, or a coast down the rolling hills in winter. She entered into the sport of the moment with her whole heart. When there was no outlet for her superabundant energy, she was genuinely unhappy. Then it was that a self-conscious and morbid sensitiveness became so evident that it was a source of real concern to her friends. "People say I must have been born brave," said Clara Barton. "Why, I seem to remember nothing but terrors in my early days. I was a shrinking little bundle of fears of thunder, fears of strange faces, fears of my strange self. It was only when thought and feeling were merged in the zest of some interesting activity that she lost her painful shyness and found herself. When she was 11 years old, she had her first experience as a nurse. A fall which gave David a serious blow on the head, together with the bungling ministrations of doctors, who, when in doubt, had recourse only to the heroic treatment of bleeding and leeches, brought the vigorous young brother to a protracted invalidism. For 2 years, Clara was his constant and devoted attendant. She schooled herself to remain calm, cheerful, and resourceful in the presence of suffering and exacting demands. When others gave way to fatigue or nerves, her wonderful instinct for action kept her, a child though she was, at her post. Her sympathy expressed itself in untiring service. In the years that followed her brother's recovery, Clara became a real problem to herself and her friends. The old blighting sensitiveness made her school days restless and unhappy in spite of her alert mind and many interests. At length her mother, at her wits' end because of this baffling morbid strain in her remarkable daughter, was advised by a man of sane judgment and considerable understanding of a child nature to throw responsibility upon her and give her a school to teach. It happened, therefore, that when Clara Barton was 15, she put down her skirts, put up her hair, and entered upon her successful career as a teacher. She liked the children and believed them entering enthusiastically into their concerns and opening the way to new interests. When asked how she managed the discipline of the troublesome ones, she said, "The children give me no trouble. I never have to discipline at all," quite unconscious of the fact that her vital influence gave her a control that made assertion of authority unnecessary. When the boys found that I was as strong as they were and could teach them something on the playground, they thought that perhaps we might discover together a few other worthwhile things in school hours," she said. For 18 years, Clara Barton was a teacher, always learning herself while teaching others. She decided in 1852 to enter Clinton Liberal Institute in New York as a pupil for graduation, for there was then no college whose doors were open to women. When she had all that the Institute could give her, she looked about for new fields for effort. In Bordentown, New Jersey, she found there was a peculiar need for someone who would bring to her task pioneer zeal as well as the passion for teaching. At that time, there were no public schools in the town, nor, indeed, in the state. The people who pose as respectable are too proud and too prejudiced to send their boys and girls to a free pauper school, and in the meantime, all the children run wild, Miss Barton was told. "We have tried again and again," said a discouraged young pedagogue. "It is impossible to do anything in this place." "Give me 3 months and I will teach free," said Clara Barton. This was just the sort of challenge she loved. There was something to be done. She began with 6 unpromising gamins in a dilapidated empty building. In a month, her quarters proved too narrow. Each youngster became enthusiastic and effectual advertisement. As always, her success lay in an understanding of her pupils as individuals and a quickening interest that brought out the latent possibilities of each. The school of 6 grew in a year to one of 600, and the thoroughly converted citizens built an 8-room schoolhouse where Miss Barton remained as principal and teacher until a breakdown of her voice made complete rest necessary. The weak throat soon made it evident that her teaching days were over, but she found at the same time in Washington, where she had gone for recuperation, a new work. "Living is doing," she said. "Even while we say there is nothing we can do, we stumble over the opportunities for service that we are passing by in our tear-blinded self-pity." The oversensitive girl had learned her lesson well. Life offered moment by moment too many chances for action for a single worker to turn aside to bemoan his own peculiar condition. The retired teacher became a confidential secretary in the office of the Commissioner of Patents. Great confusion existed in the patent office at that time because some clerks had betrayed the secrets of certain inventions. Miss Barton was the first woman to be employed in a government department, and while ably handling the critical situation that called for all her energy and resourcefulness, she had to cope not only with the scarcely veiled enmity of those fellow workers who were guilty or jealous, but also with the open antagonism of the rank and file of the clerks, who were indignant because a woman had been placed in a position of responsibility and influence. She endured covert slander and deliberate disrespect, letting her character and the quality of her work speak for themselves. They spoke so eloquently that when a change in political control caused her removal, she was before long recalled to straighten out the tangle that had ensued. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Miss Barton was therefore at the very storm center. The early days of the conflict found her binding up the wounds of the Massachusetts boys who had been attacked by a mob while passing through Baltimore, and who for a time were quartered in the capital. Some of these recruits were boys from Miss Barton's own town who had been her pupils, and all were dear to her because they were offering their lives for the Union. We find her with other volunteer nurses caring for the injured, feeding groups who had gathered about her in the Senate chamber, and from the desk of the President of the Senate, reading them the home news from the Worcester papers. Meeting the needs as they presented themselves in that time of general panic and distress, she sent to the Worcester Spy appeals for money and supplies. Other papers took up the work, and soon Miss Barton had to secure space in a large warehouse to hold the provisions that poured in. Not for many days, however, did she remain a steward of supplies. When she met the transports which brought the wounded into the city, her whole nature revolted at the sight of the untold suffering and countless deaths which were resulting from delay in caring for the injured. Her flaming ardor, her rare executive ability, and her tireless persistence won for her the confidence of those in command, and though it was against all traditions, to say nothing of ironclad army regulations, she obtained permission to go with her stores of food, bandages, and medicines to the firing line, where relief might be given on the battlefield at the time of direst need. The girl who had been a bundle of fears had grown into a woman who braved every danger and any suffering to carry help to her fellow countrymen. People who spoke of her rare initiative and practical judgment had little comprehension of the absolute simplicity and directness of her methods. She managed the sulky, rebellious drivers of her army wagons, who had little respect for orders that placed a woman in control, in the same way that she had managed children in school. Without relaxing her firmness, she spoke to them courteously and called them to share the warm dinner she had prepared and spread out in an appetizing fashion. When, after clearing away the dishes, she was sitting alone by the fire, the men returned in an awkward, self-conscious group. "We didn't come to get warm," said their spokesman, as she kindly moved to make room for them at the flames. "We come to tell you we are ashamed. The truth is, we didn't want to come. We know there is fighting ahead, and we've seen enough of that for men who don't carry muskets, only whips. And then we've never seen a train under charge of a woman before, and we couldn't understand it. We've been mean and contrary all day, and you've treated us as if we'd been the general and his staff, and given us the best meal we've had in 2 years. We want to ask your forgiveness, and we shan't trouble you again." She found that a comfortable bed had been arranged for her in her ambulance. A lantern was hanging from the roof. And when the next morning she emerged from her shelter, a steaming breakfast awaited her, and a devoted corps of assistants stood ready for orders. "I had cooked my last meal for my drivers," said Clara Barton. "These men remained with me 6 months through the frost and snow, and march and camp and battle. They nursed the sick, dressed the wounded, soothed the dying, and buried the dead, and if possible, they grew kinder and gentler every day." An incident that occurred at Antietam is typical of her quiet efficiency. According to her directions, the wounded were being fed with bread and crackers moistened in wine, when one of her assistants came to report that the entire supply was exhausted, while many helpless ones lay on the field unfed. Miss Barton's quick eye had noted that the boxes from which the wine was taken had fine Indian meal as packing. 6 large kettles were at once unearthed from the farmhouse in which they had been taken quarters, and soon her men were carrying buckets of hot gruel for miles over the fields where lay hundreds of wounded and dying. Suddenly, in the midst of her labors, Miss Barton came upon the surgeon in charge, sitting alone, gazing at a small piece of tallow candle which flickered uncertainly in the middle of a table. "Tired, doctor?" she asked sympathetically. "Tired indeed," he replied bitterly. "Tired of such heartless neglect and carelessness. What am I to do for my 1,000 wounded men, with night here and that inch of candle all the light I have or can get?" Miss Barton took him by the arm and led him to the door, where he could see the near barn scores of lanterns gleaming like stars. "What is that?" he asked, amazed. "The barn is lighted," she replied, "and the house will be directly." "Where did you get them?" he gasped. "Brought them with me." "How many have you?" "All you want. 4 boxes." The surgeon looked at her for a moment as if he were waking from a dream, and then, as if it were the only answer he could make, fell to work. And so it was invariably that she won her complete command of people as she did of situations, by always proving herself equal to the emergency of the moment. Though, as she said in explaining the tardiness of a letter, "My hands complain a little of unaccustomed hardships." She never complained of any ill, nor allowed any danger or difficulty to interrupt her work. "Where are my puny ailments beside the agony of our poor shattered boys lying helpless on the field?" she said. And so, while doctors and officers wondered at her unlimited capacity for prompt and effective action, the men who had felt her sympathetic touch and effectual aid loved and revered her as the angel of the battlefield. When the war was ended and the survivors of the great armies were marching homeward, her heart was touched by the distress in many homes, where sons and fathers and brothers were among those listed as missing. In all, there were 80,000 men of whom no definite report could be given to their friends. She was assisting President Lincoln in answering the hundreds of heartbroken letters, imploring news which poured in from all over the land when his tragic death left her alone with the task. Then, as no funds were available to finance a thorough investigation of every sort of record of states, hospitals, prisons, and battlefields, she maintained out of her own means a bureau to prosecute the search. 4 years were spent in this great labor, during which time Miss Barton made many public addresses, the proceeds of which were devoted to the cause. One evening in the winter of 1868, while in the midst of a lecture, her voice suddenly left her. This was the beginning of a complete nervous collapse. The hardships and prolonged strain had, in spite of her robust constitution and iron will, told at last on the endurance of that loyal worker. When able to travel, she went to Geneva, Switzerland, in the hope of winning back her health and strength. Soon after her arrival, she was visited by the President and members of the International Committee for the Relief of the Wounded in War, who came to learn why the United States had refused to sign the Treaty of Geneva, providing for the relief of sick and wounded soldiers. Of all the civilized nations, our great republic alone most unaccountably held aloof. Miss Barton at once set herself to learn all she could about the ideals and methods of the International Red Cross, and during the Franco-Prussian War she had abundant opportunity to see and experience its practical working on the battlefield. At the outbreak of the war in 1870, she was urged to go as a leader, taking the same part that she had borne in the Civil War. "I had not strength to trust for that," said Clara Barton, and declined with thanks, promising to follow in my own time and way. "I did follow within a week. As I journeyed on," she continued, "I saw the work of these Red Cross societies in the field, accomplishing in 4 months under their systematic organization what we failed to accomplish in 4 years without it. No mistakes, no needless suffering, no waste, no confusion, but order, plenty, cleanliness, and comfort. Wherever that little flag made its way, a whole continent marshaled under the banner of the Red Cross. As I saw all this and joined and worked in it, you will not wonder that I said to myself, if I live to return to my country, I will try to make my people understand the Red Cross and that treaty." Months of service in caring for the wounded and the helpless victims of siege and famine were followed by a period of nervous exhaustion from which she but slowly crept back to her former hold on health. At last she was able to return to America to devote herself to bringing her country into line with the Red Cross movement. She found that traditionary prejudice against entangling alliances with other powers, together with a singular failure to comprehend the vital importance of the matter, militated against the great cause. "Why should we make provisions for the wounded?" it was said. "We shall never have another war. We have learned our lesson." It came to Miss Barton then that the work of the Red Cross should be extended to disasters, such as fires, floods, earthquakes, and epidemics, great public calamities which require, like war, prompt and well-organized help. Years of devoted missionary work with preoccupied officials and a heedless, short-sighted public at length bore fruit. After the Geneva Treaty received the signature of President Arthur on March 1, 1882, it was promptly ratified by the Senate, and the American National Red Cross came into being, with Clara Barton as its first president. Through her influence, too, the International Congress of Bern adopted the American Amendment, which dealt with the extension of the Red Cross to relief measures in great calamities occurring in times of peace. The story of her life from this time on is one with the story of the work of the Red Cross during the stress of such disasters as the Mississippi River floods, the Texas famine in 1885, the Charleston earthquake in 1886, the Johnstown flood in 1899, the Russian famine in 1892, and the Spanish-American War. The prompt, efficient methods followed in the relief of the flood sufferers along the Mississippi in 1884 may serve to illustrate the sane, constructive character of her work. Supply centers were established and a steamer chartered to ply back and forth, carrying help and hope to the distracted human creatures who stood wringing their hands on a frozen, fireless shore, with every coal pit filled with water. For 3 weeks, she patrolled the river, distributing food, clothing, and fuel, caring for the sick, and in order to establish at once normal conditions of life, providing the people with many thousands of dollars worth of building material, seed, and farm implements, thus making it possible for them to help themselves and in work find a cure for their benumbing distress. Our Lady of the Red Cross lived past her 90th birthday, but her real life is measured by deeds, not days. It was truly a long one, rich in the joy of service. She abundantly proved the truth of the words, "We gain in so far as we give. If we would find our life, we must be willing to lose it." Words of note and vocabulary. Page 195. Sister Dorothy. The author means Clara's sister, not that this sister is a nun. The author calls Clara's brother, brother so-and-so as well. In reference to Note 2 on page 195, a well-known heroine, Clarissa Harlow. The book the name comes from is Clarissa, or The History of a Young Lady, written by Samuel Richardson in 1747. It is a mature and tragic tale told in the form of letters. It is an epistolary novel. Page 196, Primer. Despite its spelling, this word rhymes with dimmer, and was the little handbook used to teach children to read. Page 196, Precocious. Precocious means exceptionally smart and composed for one's age. Usually refers to a young person who isn't the least nervous to talk with adults. 196, Note 5. Buffalo Bill was a buffalo hunter, scout, and rider for the Pony Express. His personality and adventures made him a legend of the Wild West. Note on page 197. The horse was broken only to bit and halter. This means that the horse was used to wearing a harness. A halter is the leather strap that made the harness around the horse's head. The bit is a metal piece that sits in the horse's mouth, and maybe being led around some, but was otherwise not trained to be ridden. Note on page 198. Satinet mills. A satin-like looking material made of cotton. Also on page 198, Billy is the name of her horse. Note on page 199, Invalidism. An invalid is someone who is weak or sick, unable to do things. Note on page 200, Pedagogue, meaning a teacher. Also on page 200, Gaymans. Note 11. A gayman is a rough street child. Note on page 201, Latent. Latent means dormant, sleeping, unawoken. Note on page 201, number 13, Antagonism means hostile resistance. Also on page 201, note 14, Rank and file. Rank and file is a phrase meaning regular workers as opposed to the people in leadership. Note on page 202, Covert. Covert means cleverly subtle, hidden. Also on 202, note 16, Slander. Slander means untrue, damaging statements or accusations. Note 17, also on page 202, Worcester, a city in Massachusetts. Also on 202, note 18, Ardor. Ardor means passion. On page 203, note 19, Diarist, meaning most desperate. Note on page 204, note 20, Antietam is now the city of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Also on page 204, note 21, Tallow, meaning animal fat. Note 22 on page 206, here the word prosecute means to see something to its end. On page 207, note 23, Siege. A siege is when an army surrounds and cuts off the supplies of a city. Also on page 207, note 24, Militated. Militated means worked.